Hello, and welcome to our webinar on customer loyalty programs and maturing data management capabilities to drive customer loyalty. Today, we're joined by two data strategy experts, Mark Malone and Tenny Pan. Before we begin, I'll mention that we are recording this webinar. It will be available on the ETHOS privacy website shortly after the broadcast. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A or the chat. We'll answer as many of them as we can during today's webinar. Mark Malone is the Director of Data Strategy at Blueprint Technologies. As an attorney and data strategist, he works with clients to implement product features relating to cybersecurity and privacy, along with analytics, cloud, and artificial intelligence. At Blueprint, he's leading the development of data governance products and services that enable organizations to manage visible, trusted data. Prior to Blueprint, Mark was the Director of Global Strategy at Boeing. Tenny Pan is a privacy program manager at ETHOS Privacy. She works with clients to guide compliance efforts with continuously evolving requirements in the modern privacy landscape by managing projects in privacy and privacy technology. Prior to joining ETHOS, she was a senior analyst with Lowe's, leading a team in privacy program operations where she worked heavily in customer data, supporting privacy engineering product development and prototype new capabilities for privacy solutions. I'll also mention that there is going to be a workshop planned for later this spring. So should this topic interest you, there'll be an opportunity to dive in further depth. So let's get started. Tenny, let's hit the first slide.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And some of our goals for takeaways from this webinar are really to start that conversation and identify those components that support customer loyalty programs and help you understand the actions that you can take to increase your capabilities for your program, as well as turn compliance functions like privacy and data governance into loyalty program enablers. So our hope is that this webinar will be foundational and really start that conversation to get you moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and building on that, we really want to give you an understanding of what some of those foundational capabilities are, regardless of the current state of maturity of your program. And once you get a sense of where you are, then you can really focus your actions on things that will be targeted to improving your maturity and really getting your customer experience to be a good experience. And what we'll do is give you a variety of different methods for showing you how to collaborate across the enterprise so that you can start leveraging resources, talent, data from many different business units and functions, and all collaborating together to improve the customer experience of your program.
Right, so as we start talking about the value of loyalty programs and how we're going to increase the maturity of them, we want to start talking about why loyalty is important now, why is it a hot topic? And, from what you understand and what you may already know is that with Google's deprecation of third-party cookies, we are losing that functionality and that view into customer data and those insights. And so we're looking for an alternative way, and we believe that would be loyalty programs in order for you to understand those customer preferences. So,
yeah. And, really what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a number of changes. We're seeing technical changes, the way that third-party cookies are able to be used, and we're also seeing cultural changes, the expectation of the customer and what they want to see from a privacy perspective, what they expect in order to trust you and really be loyal to your brand and increase the stickiness of your brand. So even though this is a bit of a disruptive time, it's a good opportunity to start establishing a more direct relationship with your customer. And what you'll see is this will allow you to better understand the customer and also better manage the customer's data. It'll give you a direct pipeline into the customers that you can really start to understand their preferences directly from them by getting feedback. And it also gives you a chance to increase the transparency of how you manage the data and provide that transparency to your customers so that you're setting the right expectations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right, Mark. And so that's why we want to start talking about the privacy and data governance as those enablers, right? As it's talked about the stickiness of your loyalty program, privacy and data governance really help to facilitate that and provide that transparency and maintain that consumer trust. So how do we do that? We introduced this maturity model, which we felt as a great tool, and starting that conversation on assessing where you are in your current state and what direction you need to go. So this as a tool helps us identify specific actions that you need to take in order to move up to those levels of maturity. And whether that be through, like Mara mentioned, data capabilities, or really identifying those roles and responsibilities for people in your program, and helping facilitate that discussion across your enterprise and start to have that collaboration where you can move forward to those outcomes for loyalty.
Yeah, and we'll keep coming back to this model, and you'll just see just a word about how it's structured. When we talk about advanced and intermediate and basic, really at a high level, we're talking about the clarity of your strategy, whether you've identified specific goals and whether you're capable of measuring against those goals. When we start talking about predictive, personalized, transactional, we're really talking about the data you collect and your ability to process that data and actually make decisions that will influence your customers' behavior. And then when we think about strategic, tactical, operational, what we're really talking about there is organizationally, are you able to work outside of your stovepipe? If you're in marketing, do you know how to effectively collaborate with others so that you can bring the right data and the right talent to achieve the goals, to solve problems, and quickly stand up teams in order to accomplish that? This is important because with any program, but especially customer loyalty, you want to clearly be able to articulate the value of the programming. You need to be able to build momentum. So you need to get better at forming those teams, because as new use cases come up, you want to be able to bring the right data to solve whatever problem you're trying to address. So your ability to mature will reflect your ability to start recruiting these people and bringing them in to more effectively solve whatever challenges come up for your customer loyalty program.
So as we're talking about at the basic level, like Mark mentioned, we're working at a transactional and operational level. So the data that you are focusing on is mostly a snapshot in time, and you don't really have a way to tie it back to your customer to personalize those rewards and really understand your customer behavioral trends. And like you mentioned, operational. So everything is managed in a stovepipe. So it's siloed, and you're not really using the data that you're gathering through your loyalty program and being able to support other business functions and have it span across the enterprise. So as we're talking about these capabilities, we want to start thinking about, when you're moving up to the more intermediate level, what things can you unlock and start to lay the groundwork for to gain the intermediate level. So first thing being really starting to define who your customer is and really understanding how you can uniquely identify them, and tying that, not only having the product and reward data, but having a defined customer set as well. And then laying the architecture. So as you'll see in our next scenarios that we're going to introduce is what type of processing you're working off of. So having that data model and that infrastructure to be able to process things in real time rather than potentially batch processing. So
yeah, and just a few words when you're just starting your loyalty program. The overarching goal typically is to deliver a better customer experience, and what we really mean by customer experience, we mean, how do you make your customer happy? You do that by getting to know your customer, understand what they like, their preferences, and start to try and guide their behavior in a way that increases the stickiness of your brand. The challenge you'll have at this level is you're only capturing this transactional data. It's historical. You're basically reporting the news. These are things that happened in the past. And at this point, you probably are not able to tie that data back to a unique customer. So when you're at this level, we recommend that you start focusing on some of the foundational data management capabilities, including, as Tenny mentioned, this data model, which we'll get to in a moment. Also at this point, you're probably just working in a stovepipe. Your customer loyalty program is probably being led only by somebody in marketing, and they haven't yet really learn how to bring in other data people to help solve these problems. So they need to get better at that. And also, when you're fairly immature from a program standpoint, it's really hard to articulate what the return on investment is. So it may be hard to kind of get the momentum that you're looking for at this point. So what we recommend is to really start focusing by defining what you mean by customer, and we'll get to that momentarily.
Right, and to build on that point, Mark, when you're talking about the return on investment, when we're introducing like at this level, you're really trying to just increase the amount of transaction your customer is making, right? So we'll talk about that in that hypothetical. So here we want to start introducing this hypothetical scenario with a startup coffee company that we're going to call Beanco. So for them, they're just starting on their loyalty journey. And what they could start out with is a very basic analog points card. As they generate, 10 purchases, you get a reward based on 1 coffee. And at this point, you're not really generating data, you're not collecting data on the customer, you're really only capturing at the transactional level. And when we're talking about moving in the logical progression from this basic card, this points program, we can start thinking about introducing a digitized version where it's a magnetic stripe, you can swipe it, but and starting to present that experience to collect and generate that consumer data. But it's still basic because we're only capturing that transactional data, right? So, and this step will be important in your progression towards intermediate maturity, but we'll start talking about how this can tie in with our conceptual data model when you start to define the customer.
Yeah, and I like this hypothetical because the reality of the way a lot of these programs work is, depending on the size and complexity and the industry that you're in, you may or may not need a more complex program. And typically, as people start thinking about improving data capabilities, there could be some digital transformation initiative, and you start looking at how you do things today more in an analog manner, like this punch card. And it just provides you with a starting point. So the logical place, if you have a punch card to go, is to have another card, but now you actually have that mag strip and you start capturing data. And, this is an opportunity to think about what is it that you're really capturing on this card, right? So you're capturing transactions. In this case, you have a card where you get 10 punches, and on the 10th punch, you get a free coffee. So the things it doesn't tell you necessarily is it doesn't really tell you who your customer is. It doesn't really give you any meaningful way to alter their behavior or guide them or really guide their experience. And even once you move to a magnetic strip on a card, you still have a limited ability to gather data and also to present data or present information to influence your customers. So this is, once again, very basic, very transactional. And you can start thinking, though, about all of the different ways you can capture data and process data to start tailoring the customer experience. So this is where you start.
Right. So building upon that, as we're talking about introducing the architecture to be able to ingest that data that you're capturing. So the conceptual data model here is, an example of how you would potentially define a unique customer, how you would define your reward data set. And this being an example, you could even expand this out to gathering like a contact method, actual product data, and those attributes tying into that digitized card, right? So if we go back to that hypothetical scenario, at that point, you're really focusing on just the purchases and what rewards you could provide back, but there's no way to kind of get ahead of the customer and really influence their behavior like Mark mentioned. So, and a logical next step would be introducing contact methods. So you're capturing attributes like email or phone. So, with a digitized card as a loyalty program, you're not really incentivizing them because the time that you're capturing and being able to offer those rewards are at the point of sale, and you're not being able to convince them to come in prior to that, right? So they're already likely making a purchase at that point. So
Yeah, and the conceptual data model, it's a great place to start for a whole bunch of different reasons. You know, when you think about your ability to coordinate and get input from people and start really identifying what your goals are, how you're going to determine whether customer loyalty, your program is successful, this is a good place to start thinking about that. And as you start defining what you mean by important types of data, like customer, like product, like reward, this is an opportunity to reach out to other areas within your company and start bringing them on the journey. Because what you'll find is you'll need different sources of data to get that view of the customer. And you'll start finding right away that if you are unable to bring the managers of those systems or the stewards of those data, if you can't bring them to the table and start thinking about how you actually define customer and how you uniquely identify customer, then chances are they are not going to be part of your program. That's the reality. They need to be willing to come to the table and start talking constructively towards agreeing on what that definition means. So a lot of this foundational work will really start helping inform you as to who should be part of the program, how do you get them involved, and this is just a good way of really engaging and solving a problem together, and slowly start to understand who are all of the different players who can help you as you start to identify customer. Because until you uniquely identify your customer, it's really hard to start personalizing things, right? So this is a really good place to start. It also shows a connection between something very technical that someone like a data engineer would probably be leading this, and how they need to start reaching out to the business to understand how they engage customers, how they define customers, and all of these attributes. Eventually what you'll see as we start maturing is some of these attributes may or may not be sensitive. So to give you an example, it may be really easy to uniquely identify a customer by their social security number, but that probably isn't the best way to do it for a variety of reasons, including privacy. But you probably wouldn't know that if you hadn't already engaged somebody from the privacy function. So as you uniquely identify customer and you spend time identifying the data sources, thinking about the attributes, and then getting different points of view, this will give you more of an ability to start identifying the right people, to start thinking about how you manage that data and how you manage that risk.
Yep. So as we're starting to talk about building that groundwork, and as we move towards the intermediate maturity level, at this point, we're starting to look at personalized and tactical characteristics. So now that you've potentially put in the foundation to have that data model, so you're being able to ingest the consumer and the product data and purchases, you can now model who bought what, and you understand who your customer is, and start to personalize your rewards based on that data. So at this point, you're hopefully leveraging those defined data sets from not only just historical, but those current transactions, and be able to offer rewards based on that. And like Mark mentioned, when you're starting to have that conversation, engaging other teams, data scientists, data engineers, to really uniquely identify your customer, and as well as privacy, to kind of understand what attributes you can collect, you are also starting to incorporate this across multiple business functions and units, right? So you're being able to span across the enterprise. And so as we're moving towards the more advanced stage, what we want to start thinking about is how you can integrate additional data dimensions. Like, you already have customer and your product defined. Can you integrate time and location to further enrich that data set, and then start to move towards past just consumer trends and metrics like that, but also start to get predictive analytics involved as well, and start to understand why a consumer is buying something, and kind of getting ahead of that.
Yeah, and building on that, it's a foundational concept that your metrics, the way that you measure whether or not your customer loyalty program is a success, the metric can't be more mature than the program, right? The metric should reflect the maturity of the program. So, if you're only capturing transactional data, your metric is going to be very basic. It's a snapshot in time. The hope is, as you move up to the next level of maturity, now you're able to uniquely identify the customer. You're collecting data that you have some level of confidence relates to their purchase history. So now you can move from that activity metric and start looking at trends to really understand, why they're buying things. You're moving from the who bought what to the why. That's how you should be leveraging the data. And, as Tenny mentioned, you can start, once you have that foundational conceptual model, you can start thinking about adding new dimensions and enriching it, and really start personalizing what you offer, the incentives you offer to improve the experience of the customer and really make them happy with your product or your service. So while at the basic level, you need to focus on those foundational data management capabilities like a model. Now at the intermediate level, as you start to personalize things by virtue of that, you're collecting more personal data. So now you need to start managing the risk associated with more sensitive types of data, which we'll show you in a moment.
We're starting to talk about risk management strategies in addition to data management. Right. So building upon our hypothetical scenario with the cars with Beanco, the logical progression that we're evolving the program with is, moving away from just the digital card, but starting to introduce a digital app. So this is where your company can control the user experience. You're delivering a consistent user experience. You're able to influence behavior. So like we mentioned before, starting to collect and lay the groundwork for incorporating real-time processing, time and location. How can we start to open up that open communication with your customer, that back and forth, so you're able to provide value to them through points or a discount, those types of rewards, but they're also able to provide value back. So through the app, they could potentially give you feedback, give you, sentiment, direct data on whether they not liked the reward they received. And as a backwards, you're able to leverage additional data that you're able to collect using an app versus just a digital card, and being able to use that and personalize and incentivize the rewards that you're providing.
Yeah, there's a number of benefits to using an app and moving away from just a magnetic card. And like Tenny said, this is the way that you increase the loyalty of your customers is by delivering a better experience and a more consistent experience. And a good way of doing that is through an app. And, one of the things which we'll get to, as we mentioned, during this stage of maturity, you need to start focusing on risk management, data risk management, and really having your customer getting used to interacting with you through something like an app is a great way to get that direct feedback from the customer to learn about their preferences. But it's also a great way to start gathering their consent as new uses of their data become apparent. And by doing that, by being transparent and by setting the right expectation for the customer and then meeting that expectation through good data management practices, that is what leads to trust. And that is what improves the experience of your customer, because this should all be about providing things of value, things that are meaningful to the customer. So as you get better in understanding things like when they bought things, where they bought things, why they bought it, and then you start offering them new products that they may have not thought about, the better you get at that, the more you're going to increase the loyalty of the customer and actually increase the stickiness of the brands. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm. And so like we've talked about, as you're starting to personalize and understand your customer, the more sensitive data that you're collecting. So I think at this point, it's good to drive home that privacy can help maximize your loyalty program value, because you're working with that personal data. So the more personal data and sensitive data you're collecting, you want to engage with your privacy professionals. And there's a couple of data concepts that we consider important, right? That data minimization, data sensitivity. So as you're like with the conceptual data model, as you're identifying your customer, what pieces of data and what are you collecting, and making sure you're mitigating and managing that risk and still providing that value and support to your loyalty program goals. And then also with considering privacy by design, right? If we're working with starting up a loyalty program, it is good to engage with privacy and start to put those guardrails in place so that you're able to protect and understand the uses of that personal data at the start of your program. So when the time comes that you are under a specific compliance framework, you're prepared and you're ready. And so there's no surprises there. And in addition to that, when we're talking about consumer trust and having maintaining that consumer relationship, privacy is really a great facilitator in that and help support that, because you're being transparent and you're setting those expectations with your consumer on how you're using your data, what you're collecting it, and if you're sharing it. So with privacy as a partner, you're really being able to demonstrate that good data stewardship and maintaining that transparency. And so you're maintaining that trust that's important to having that stickiness of your loyalty program.
Yeah, and by really spending time thinking about how you manage the data and being a good steward of the data, and really demonstrating that you know when and how to bring different compliance functions on board, like privacy, like legal, you're establishing that relationship, and you're giving these different functions in your organization confidence that you actually know how to manage the data. And that establishing that relationship is going to be essential to your loyalty program, because then it just makes it easier to bring them on board and increase that confidence. And also they can really help you take a harder look at how you interact with your customer. They can help you really define the life cycle of your relationship with the customer, because you will be collecting different types of data at each point in these certain milestones with your customer. And as you start to personalize the rewards to the customer, that data will probably become more and more sensitive, and you need to think about managing that data more and more effectively so that you can really start personalizing the experience to the.
So building upon
You're really starting in the right foot.
Sorry, I lost you for a second, Mark. Okay.
Am I back?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So yes, with the advanced level and building upon the levels that we've talked about, moving from you're in a stovepipe, it's transactional data, snapshot in time, and then going towards understanding your customer, tying it back to the product, and starting to measure trends. At the advanced level, we're now moving in towards not only looking at the trends, but leveraging predictive analytics, right? Other data dimensions, so that we're able to augment that customer and product data that we've defined with time and location, incorporating new tech like real-time processing, and being able to use that data and the technology across the enterprise. So it becomes an integral part of your customer engagement at your organization. And so, next steps, and Mark, you can speak to this a little bit more, but really establishing that model, that operating model, so that you have leadership buy-in, and really working cross collaboratively across the enterprise.
Yeah, hopefully what you see here is that these are different steps in maturity where you're getting more clarity around who your customer is. You're starting to really articulate what your goals are. You have a better sense of your strategy, and you're able to actually start working across the enterprise. And the goal here is that as you start identifying outcomes that you want to achieve from your program, you are able to bring data and bring the different skills that you need to understand that data so that you can determine if you're reaching those goals, and you can also more effectively improve the experience that your customer receives. So by this stage, by the advanced stage, you now hopefully understand the different roles who play a part in managing the data, managing the risk. You understand what their responsibilities are. You understand what steps they take. You have to be good at communicating the value of your program. So by the time you've reached this stage, the idea of governance starts to really play a part, because without governance, you can't really effectively manage at that enterprise level. And when I say governance, what I mean is your ability to formalize your authority and control over the way you define, produce, and use data. That's what I mean by data governance. So at this point, what we've seen is the customer loyalty program is a great forcing function to improve that maturity for your governance capabilities. And we'll start laying them out a bit more, but that's really the point. You've really learned how to govern without even calling it governance, just through better management, through better risk management, through better collaboration, and through that strategic clarity, you're able to actually better manage this data.
So again, this is building off of that Beanco hypothetical scenario. As we're moving and working off of a digital app, here's some things that we can start to consider, like incorporating feedback and having that customer give us that zero-party data, right? They're giving us data in exchange for some type of value, and really understanding, how they feel about the products that you're offering, rather than having to make those inferences. And with this, we're also introducing, location data. Beanco is opening up 7 different stores. So with the app, you're able to use in-store push notifications. So being able to target them when they're in a specific store, understanding what time of day they're making purchases, and using that data to trigger specific incentives to support that return on investment.
Yeah, that's right. And once again, at this point, you've moved beyond the analog card or the card with the mag strip, and you've started to think about other ways of interacting with your customers. What you see up on the screen, is how you can leverage something like an app to actually get direct feedback from the customer about their preferences. There's also this idea of incorporating time and location, and that allows you to take more sophisticated approaches to personalizing the experience, including things like push notifications. So you start really looking at where the customer is, what the time of day is. If you've incorporated things like a point system for your loyalty program, now you can start tying all these things together to incentivize them at specific times of the day and to purchase some product over another product. So you're really starting to get to the why. And the best part about that is now you're creating kind of this flywheel effect where you're gathering data from your customer about their preferences. If you've also spent the time to define what you mean by product, you can now start tying these things together. So your customers' preferences maybe influence the way you develop your products, which influence your customers, and you start getting into that type of a cycle. Now, naturally, the other piece of this, which we touched on before, but I'll touch on again, not only do you need to focus on the data you collect, but also your ability to process that data. So as you move into this advanced stage and you're thinking about maybe moving your data into an analytics platform, you need to start thinking about things in real time and how you can start capturing that data and actually acting on that data. The faster you're able to capture and act on that data, the more valuable it'll be to your program, and you will be better at actually influencing the customer experience. So that's the next thing that you focus on during this advanced stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right, Mark. Like building on when we're talking about, at the basic level, you're working off of batch processing, and now you're moving not only are you talking about the data you're collecting, but the technology, right? Being able to act on that stuff real time with push notifications and being able to align those actions with the time of purchase and at that specific location. So driving that data model.
Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing here, which is, each of these different stages of maturity, and each time you start taking another look at your capabilities, that's a good opportunity to just kind of refresh your efforts. And, to use an example, when you're moving to this stage, and maybe you're modernizing your architecture, maybe you're moving into the cloud, maybe you're taking advantage of an analytics platform, that's a great time to use that initiative as a forcing function to really get better at managing the data, governing the data, right? This is where you can start really identifying who are the stewards, for instance, of that data, and bringing them to the table to start defining the attributes associated with that data. And you can take another look at the quality of that data to make sure that it's actually fit for whatever purpose you intend to use it for. So all of these different, at each of these levels, as you move through them, it's also helpful to think of it as that forcing function. And really, as an example, the conceptual data model, that would really be a foundational aspect to doing something like creating a catalog, right? Because if you're getting good metadata, that's a good catalog. And if you have a formal role for doing all that, then that'll allow you to continue to do it over time. And you'll really start to be able to gain value from the data more and more as you get used to doing these types of activities.
So just providing an overview of what we've talked about, and we've kind of touched upon the capabilities at each level. So at the basic level, we're working with two primary capabilities, your data and your tech or tools at that point. So, defining what data you need, and also understanding the tools that you have at hand, right? You're using basic tools to be able to capture that transactional data at, potentially through point of sale systems and using that batch processing rather than real time. And you do not yet have defined your people and your process and your metrics. And your metrics really at this point are only as good as the data you're collecting, right? So Mark, if you'd like to add on that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, once again, what we're showing you here are kind of the big dimensions or components of your data management, data risk management, really your data governance capabilities. So depending on where you are from a maturity standpoint, if you're just beginning, like we said, we think that you would be best served focusing on the data, focusing on your tools, to really get a hold specifically of understanding who your customer is, the uniqueness of your customer, and also your products. Then we get to the next level of maturity, and that's where you start focusing on people, process, and metrics. This is where, rather than working in a stovepipe, you need to start branching out and start bringing in other people and other skill sets to start thinking about the data, start thinking about the risk coming out of the data. And this is where you really need to start formalizing these roles. And the whole idea is to make it easier and easier to keep standing up these teams. You can think of them as a data team, so that they understand what business problem you're trying to solve. They can start experimenting with bringing data to solve that problem, and then capturing feedback into your program so that you continue to mature the program. That's where you should be at the intermediate level.
Right. Like you mentioned, bringing in those 3 additional capabilities, right? Starting to have that basic organizational structure for your people, defining the team that you need to make customer loyalty program a success, having those responsibilities, having the priorities for your program, establishing those and those basic processes defined, and then, introducing additional metrics, right? When we're moving up to the intermediate level and you're capturing more than just simple activities like counts of purchases, what types of purchases, you're now measuring your customers and your products against time. So being able to look at that trend and move towards outcomes. Right? And then, okay. And then moving on to advanced, building upon that, right, is introducing communications. And like we mentioned, when we're talking about analytics, moving it towards an analytics platform to be able to better process that data and level up that piece of technology.
Yeah, and at this point, hopefully you see that these capabilities, although we're discussing them from the standpoint of customer loyalty, these are really foundational data management, data risk management capabilities for any sort of program that leverages data. So these are all of the real major moving pieces that you need to think about for your program, for any program that leverages data. And this is just a way of making sure that you're focusing on the right capability at the right time, and that you're able to build on those capabilities and generate the momentum of your program. So just having a point of view and just kind of understanding what those major components are and being able to communicate them at different levels in your company will become important, because if you really want to be a data-driven enterprise, you need to be able to talk about the value of your program at different levels within your company. And especially, as you start communicating the value of your program up, you want to make sure that you're communicating that value clearly. And, for many of these programs, what success looks like is whatever metric you're using to demonstrate that you're achieving the outcome of customer loyalty. If that metric is then reflected in some ongoing meeting, whether it's depending on the nature of your company, maybe you have a steering committee or something like that, you'll know that your program is a success when that metric is actually periodically reviewed and it's added as a line item during these meetings from your leadership, because now you know that they understand the value of your program and they understand the value of the data, and that's what a successful program looks like. That's what the right momentum looks like for a customer loyalty program.
This is an overview of everything that we've talked about, the advanced, intermediate, basic levels, and each additional capability and how we build upon that.
Yeah, that's just a view of all the different aspects that we've talked about that you can think about as you develop your program.
Mm-hmm. This next slide, I like to call it data governance, empowering customer loyalty. But it's, a good tool and visualization to understand how loyalty program can then provide value to the rest of the enterprise. So we're starting off with the center of your customers and the values and the benefits that customer loyalty brings, right? Confidence, loyalty, trust, and affinity to your brand. And then with that, the personal data that they're providing, whether that be first party, third party, or maybe just the inferences that you're creating off of the data, and how the better governed this data is, the easier it's made for other functions to be able to process and digest it. And being able to have that back and forth here with privacy, so that your customers are continually providing this data over your relationship, right, at the course of the customer life cycle. Because at the we would imagine that at the beginning of a loyalty program, signup should be frictionless, so you're only providing the minimal amount of data needed for a signup. But over the course of time, as they gain more trust and confidence in your brand, they're offering up more data that you can then use to support these other initiatives like sales and marketing, and creating those inferences and profiling to better understand your customers. So your data analytics and marketing sales teams are able to leverage that data, which then can feed into the next level of leadership stakeholders. So how does leadership take this data and then make better informed decisions? So for example, being able to get a better understanding of your customer and what they want, their desires, that can help with an informed decision on buying an inventory. So really being able to get that predictive analytics, getting ahead of your customer, so that the better you understand what they want, you can then provide provide them products that they didn't even know they want. So really being able to delight your customers with this data, these informed decisions is some of the value that a loyalty program can bring. And data governance and privacy being able to really facilitate and govern the data at this starting point.
Yeah, and I think maybe so I see that we did have a question that came in that maybe we can talk a little bit about it in the context of this diagram. And the question is, how do you balance trying to collect as much data as possible to be able to make predictions regarding a consumer's likes and to create a loyalty program that may have new innovative products versus data minimization? So I think, when I see it's a great question, and when I see the question, it's kind of that tension between wanting to have all the data and wanting to also comply. I think my own point of view on this is that if you're collecting customer likes and you're getting that directly from the customer, hopefully at that point you've gotten the right notice and consent to kind of manage that. And depending on what you're doing on the back end, if at some point the customer wants you to remove that data, that could be another issue. But what I would say is different types of data gain in value or lose value over time. To the extent we're talking about real-time data, that's something that you want to be able to act on quickly. Whereas, over time, as you're amassing a bunch of data, that can be useful to identify trends. So there's definitely a tension there, and I think that you're just going to have to look at each use case and really bring privacy to the table and kind of look at it and balance that value against the risk. And I think at that point, that's where you may or may not need advice, because if the risk of the escape is going to be, if the cost of that escape is going to be higher than the value you're getting from that data, then you may want to consider minimizing it. That's one kind of way to do that balancing. So I don't know, Tenny, did you have any thoughts on that piece?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think at that point, to build upon what you're saying, managing that risk versus the value that you're gaining. So if you're talking about predictive analytics and you kind of bring data science into the table, it begs the question, having that conversation with privacy and your loyalty program stakeholders, is this data attribute necessary to still provide you that predictive analytics that you need, right? Can you operate with de-anonymization? Can you work with an aggregated data set? So you're kind of removing that risk and removing the personal and sensitive information from that. Like, would you need to, potentially, if you're working off of, for example, a birthday reward, do you need to operate with the actual birth date where it's considered PI, or can you aggregate your data set so you're looking at all customers in the birth month of July, for example? And I think that might be a better way of looking at it as a strategy point of view, is can you balance that risk and the value, and can you move towards maybe using an aggregated data set instead? So you're still collecting all of that data, but not tying something personal to it.
Yeah, great. Karen, did we collect any other questions?
Not so far, Mark. So keep going.
Okay, so we have reached the end of the material. Oh, I do see another question. Let's see what we have here. How can you achieve informed consent when acquiring third-party data and data science comes into the mix? So I guess my first response to that is, or my first instinct there is, as we described a little earlier, the name of the game here is quickly standing up data teams to solve problems. As you start actually documenting how you solve those problems, you should get better at actually articulating the problem statement, right? And really articulating what use you want to make of it, and then what types of commitments you get from the producers of that data, whether it's inside your company or outside. So, you know, what I would say is that informed consent, what makes it informed is really providing the transparency around the data that you are collecting and against the uses that you make of that data. And by actually having something like that app where your customers are getting used to interacting with you and telling you about their preferences and whatnot, that is a good place to start getting that consent. And, you know, to the extent that you need to get some new consent because the use case has changed. When the use of that data changes, that's a good time to think about getting that consent. Tenny, did you have any other thoughts there?
Yeah, and I think if I'm understanding it correctly, you're talking about laying that groundwork so that you're logging and recording that consent. So having both the opt-in or an opt-out mechanism in place, so that when you are working with that data set, you have that tied to your defined customer and product data. Does that answer your question?
I think that's a good answer. So if there aren't, oh, there we go. You're welcome. So we have a poll that we'd love for you to take. You know, we do what the material that we presented to you today really is just kind of the first step to give you an understanding of the concepts that how we look at customer loyalty. You know, we do offer workshops to really look at your specific situation and provide you with various types of assessments from a data governance and from a privacy standpoint, and also really help to create an operating model so that you can actually implement these things in a meaningful way. Those are things we'd love to talk with anyone offline who's interested in that. And if you have the chance, we'd love to get some feedback from you on what you learned today, and hopefully it was a good experience. Thank you very much for participating, and we'll be talking to you.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tenny. Thanks very much for this informative session. I'm going to end the poll now. This is interesting, though, to take a look at just where people are at, and I'm a little surprised that no one thinks they're intermediate. So, which is, you know, you just never know how these polls are going to turn out. We have other webinars that are planned. Some will be on CPRA, and if you've got employees in California, you'll want to know about that one. And this webinar will be posted on our website at its conclusion. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.